Fall asleep softly, gently, quickly, as you listen to the classics. Today, we are presenting A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens, Chapter 4, and also the conclusion of the Christmas Carol. Look in the playlist below for our other videos. Chapter 4, The Last of the Spirits. The phantom slowly, gravely, silently approached. When it came near him, Scrooge bent down upon his knee, for in the very air through which the spirit moved, it seemed to scatter gloom and mystery. It was shrouded in a deep black garment which concealed its head, its face, its form, and left nothing of it visible save one outstretched hand. But for this it would have been difficult to detach its figure from the night and separate it from the darkness by which it was surrounded. He felt that it was tall and stately when it came beside him, and that its mysterious presence filled him with a solemn dread. He knew no more, for the spirit neither spoke nor moved. "I am in the presence of the ghost of Christmas yet to come," said Scrooge. The spirit answered not, but pointed onward with its hand. "You're about to show me something of the things that have not happened, but will happen in the time before us," Scrooge pursued. "Is that so, spirit?" The upper portion of the garment was contracted for an instant in its folds, as if the spirit had inclined its head. That was the only answer he received. Although well used to ghostly company by this time, Scrooge feared the silent shape so much that his legs trembled beneath him, and he found that he could hardly stand. When he prepared to follow it, the spirit paused a moment, and observing his condition, and giving him time to recover. But Scrooge was all the worse for this. It thrilled him with a vague, uncertain horror to know that behind the dusky shroud there was a ghostly eyes intensely fixed upon him, while he, though he stretched his own to the utmost, could see nothing but a spectral hand and one great heap of black. "Ghost of the future," he explained, "I fear you more than any spectre I have seen, but as I know your purpose, it is to do me good, and as I hope to live to be another man from what I was, I'm prepared to bear you company and do it with a thankful heart. Will you not speak to me?" It gave him no reply. The hand was pointed straight before them. "Lead on," said Scrooge. "Lead on. The night is waning fast, and it's precious time to me, I know. Lead on, spirit." The phantom moved away as it had come towards him. Scrooge followed in the shadow of its dress, which bore him up, he thought, and carried him along. They scarcely seemed to enter the city, for the city rather seemed to spring up upon them and encompass them of its own act. But there they were in the heart of it, on change amongst the merchants, who hurried up and down and chinked the money in their pockets, and conversed in groups, and looked at their watches, and trifled thoughtfully with their great gold seals, and so forth, as Scrooge had seen them often. The spirit stopped beside one little knot of businessmen, observing that the hand was pointed to them. Scrooge advanced to listen to their talk. "No," said a great fat man with a monstrous chin, "I don't know much about it either way. I only know he's dead." "When did he die?" inquired another. "Last night, I believe." "Why, what was the matter with him?" asked a third, taking a vast quantity of snuff out of a very large snuff box. "I thought he'd never die." "God knows," said the first with a yawn. "What has he done with his money?" asked the red-faced gentleman with a pendulous excrescence and the end of his nose that shook like the gulls of a turkey cock. "I haven't heard," said the man with the large chin, yawning again. "Left to its company, perhaps. He hasn't left it to me. That's all I know." This pleasantly was received with a general laugh. "It's likely to be a very cheap funeral," said the same speaker, "for upon my life I don't know of anybody to go to it. Suppose we make up a party and volunteer." "I don't mind going if lunch is provided," observed the gentleman with the excrescence in his nose, "but I must be fed if I make one." Another laugh. "Well, I am the most disinterested among you after all," said the first speaker, "for I never wear black gloves, and I never eat lunch, but I'll offer to go if anybody else will. When I come to think of it, I'm not at all sure I wasn't his most particular friend, for we used to stop and speak whenever we went by. Speakers and listeners strolled away and mixed with other groups. Scrooge knew the men and looked towards the spirit for an explanation. The phantom glided on into a street. Its fingers pointed to two persons meeting. Scrooge listened again, thinking that the explanation might lie here. He knew these men also perfectly. They were men of business, very wealthy, and of great importance. He had made a point of standing well in their esteem in a business point of view, that is, strictly in a business point of view. "How are you?" said one. "How are you?" returned the other. "Well," said the first, "Old Scratch has got his own at last, hey?" "So I'm told," returned the second. "Cold, isn't it?" "Seasonable for Christmas time. You're not a skater, I suppose?" No. Something else to think of. Good morning." Not another word. That was their meeting, their conversation, and their parting. Scrooge was at first inclined to be surprised that the spirit should attach importance to the conversation apparently so trivial, but feeling assured that there must have some hidden purpose, he set himself to consider what it was likely to be. They could scarcely be supposed to have any bearing on the death of Jacob, his old partner, for that was past, and this ghost province was the future. Nor could he think of anyone immediately connected with himself to whom he could apply them, but nothing doubting that to whomever they applied they had some latent moral for his own improvement, he resolved to treasure up every word he heard and everything he saw, and especially to observe the shadow of himself when it appeared, for he had an expectation that the conduct of his future self would give him the clue he missed, and would render the solution of these riddles easily. He looked about in that very place for his own image, but another man stood in his accustomed corner, and though the clock pointed to his usual time of day for being there, he saw no likeness of himself among the multitudes that poured in through the porch. It gave him little surprise, however, for he had been resolving in his mind a change of life, and thought and hoped he saw his new-born resolutions carried out in this. Quiet and dark, beside him stood the phantom with his outstretched hand. When he roused himself from his thoughtful quest, he fancied from the turn of the hand and the situation in reference to himself, that the unseen eyes were looking at him keenly. It made him shudder and feel very cold. They left the busy scene and went into an obscure part of town where Scrooge had never penetrated before, although he recognized its situation and its bad repute. They were foul and narrow, and the shops and houses wretched, the people half-naked, drunken, slipshod, ugly. Alleys and archways, like so many cesspools, disgorged their offences of smell and dirt and life upon the staggering streets, and the whole quarter wrecked with crime, with filth, and misery. Far in the den of infamous resort, there was a low-barred beetling shop below a penthouse roof, where iron old rags, bottles, bones, and greasy offal were brought. Upon the floor within were piled up heaps of rusty keys, nails, chains, hinges, files, scales, weights, and refuse iron of all kinds, secrets that a few would like to circumcise were bred and hidden in mountains of unseemly rags, masses of corrupt fat, and scrumptious of bones. Sitting in among the wares he dealt in by a charcoal stove made of old bricks was a gray-haired rascal, nearly 70 years of age, who had screened himself from the cold air without by a frowsy curtaining of miscellaneous tatters hung upon a line, and smoked his pipe in all luxury of calm retirement. Scrooge and the Phantom came into the presence of this man, just as a woman with a heavy bundle slunk into the shop. But she had scarcely entered when another woman, similarly laden, came in too, and she was closely followed by a man in faded black, who was no less startled by the sight of them than they had been upon the recognition of each other. After a short period of blank astonishment, in which the old man with the pipe had joined them, they all three burst into a laugh. "Let the charwoman alone to be the first," cried she who had entered first. "Let the laundress alone to be the second, and let the undertaker's man alone to be the third. Look here, old Joe, here's a chance. If I haven't all three met here without meaning it." "You couldn't have met in a better place," said old Joe, removing his pipe from his mouth. "Come into the parlor. You were made free of it long ago, you know, and the other two aren't strangers. Stop till I shut the door of the shop. Ah, how it creaks! There ain't such a rusty bit of metal in the place as its own hinges, I believe, and I'm sure there's no such old bones here as mine. Ha ha! We're all suitable to our callings. We're well matched. Come into the parlor. Come into the parlor." The parlor was the spare behind the screen of rags. The old man raked the fire together with an old stair-rod, and having trimmed his smoky lamp, for it was night, with the stem of his pipe, put it in his mouth again. While he did this, the woman who had already spoken threw her bundle on the floor and sat down in a flaunting manner on a stool, crossing her elbows on her knees and looking with bold defiance at the other two. "What odds, then? What odds, Mrs. Dibbler?" said the woman. "Every person has a right to take care of themselves. He always did." "That's true indeed," said the laundress. "No man more so. Why then, don't stand staring as if you're afraid, woman. Who's the wiser? We're not going to pick holes in each other's coats, I suppose." "No, indeed," said Mrs. Dibbler and the man together. "We should hope not." "Very well, then," cried the woman. "That's enough. Who's the worse for the loss of a few things like these? Not a dead man, I suppose." "No, indeed," said Mrs. Dibbler, laughing. "If he wanted to keep him after he was dead, a wicked old screw," pursued the woman. "Why hasn't he natural in his lifetime? If he had been, have had somebody to look after him when he was struck with death, instead of lying gasping out his last there, alone, by himself." "It's the truest words that ever was spoke," said Mrs. Dibbler. "It's a judgment on him." "I wish I was a little heavier judgment," replied the woman, "and it should have been, you may depend upon it. If I have laid my hand on anything else, open the bundle, old Joe, and let me know what the value of it. Speak out plain. I'm not afraid to be the first, nor afraid for them to see it. We know pretty well that we are helping ourselves before we met here. I believe it's no sin. Open the bundle, Joe." But the gallantry of her friends would not allow of this, and the man in faded black, mounting the breech first, produced his plunder. It was not extensive. A seal or two, a pencil case, a pair sleeve button, and a brooch of no great value were all. They were severely examined and appraised by old Joe, who chalked the sums he was disposed to give for them upon the wall and added them up into a total when he found there was nothing more to come. "That's your account," said Joe, "and I wouldn't give another sixpence if I were to be boiled for not doing it. Who's next?" Mrs. Dibbler was next. Sheets and towels, a little wearing apparel, 2 old-fashioned silver teaspoons, a pair of sugar tongs, and a few boots. Her account was stated on the wall in the same manner. "I always give too much to ladies. It's a weakness of mine, and that's the way I ruin myself," said old Joe. "That's your account. If you asked me for another penny and made it an open question, I'd repeat of being so liberal and knock off half a crown." "And now undo my bundle, Joe," said the first woman. Joe went down on his knees for the greater convenience of opening it, and having unfastened a great many knots, dragged out a large and heavy roll of some dark stuff. "What do you call this?" said Joe. "Bed curtains?" "Ah," returned the woman, laughing and leaning forward on her crossed arms. "Bed curtains. You don't mean to say you took him down, rings and all, with him lying there," said Joe. "Yes, I do," replied the woman. "Why not?" "You were born to make your fortune," said Joe, "and you certainly do it. I certainly shan't hold my hand when I can get anything in it by reaching it out, for the sake of such a man as he was. I promise you, Joe," returned the woman coolly. "Don't drop that oil upon the blankets now." "His blankets?" asked Joe. "Whose else do you think?" replied the woman. "He isn't likely to take cold without 'em, I dare say. I hope he didn't die of anything catching." "Ugh," said old Joe, stopping in his work and looking up. "Don't be afraid of that," returned the woman. "I ain't so fond of his company that I'd loiter about him for such things if he did. Ah, you may look through this shirt till your eyes ache, but you won't find a hole in it, nor a threadbare place. It's the best he had, and a fine one too. They'd have wasted it if it hadn't been for me." "What do you call wasting of it?" asked old Joe. "Putting it on him to be buried in, to be sure," replied the woman with a laugh. "Somebody was a fool enough to do it, but I took it off again. If calico ain't good enough for such a purpose, it isn't good enough for anything. It's quite as becoming to the body. He can't look uglier than he did in that one." Scrooge listened to this dialogue in horror. As they sat grouped upon their spoil in the scanty light afforded by the old man's lamp, he viewed them with a disdain and disgust which could hardly have been greater, though they had been obscene demons marketing the corpse itself. "Ha ha," laughed the woman, when old Joe produced a flannel bag with money in it, told out their several gains upon the ground. "This is the end of it, you see. He frightened everyone away from him while he was alive, to profit us when he was dead. Ha, ha, ha." "Spirit," said Scrooge, shuddering from head to foot, I see. The case of this unhappy man might be my own. My life tends that way now. Merciful heaven, what is this?" He recoiled in terror, for the scene had changed, and now he almost touched a bed, a bare uncurtained bed, on which beneath a ragged sheet there lay a something covered up, which, though it was dumb, announced itself in its awful language. The room was very dark, too dark to be observed with any accuracy, though Scrooge glanced around in an obedient to a secret impulse, anxious to know what kind of room it was. A pale light rising in the outer air fell straight upon the bed, and on it, plundered and breathed, unwatched, unwept, uncared for, was the body of this man. Scrooge glanced toward the phantom. Its steady hand was pointed to the head. The cover was so carelessly adjusted that the slightest raising of it, the motion of its finger upon Scrooge's part, would have disclosed the face. He thought of it, felt how easy it would be to do so, and longed to do it, but had no more power to withdraw the veil than to dismiss the spectre at his side. O cold, cold, rigid, dreadful death, set upon thine altar here, and dress it with such terrors as thou hast thy command, for this is thy dominion, but of the loved, revered, and honored head. Thou canst not turn one hair to thy dread purpose, or make one feature odious. It is not the hand is heavy and will fall down when released. It's not the heart and pulse are still, but that the hand was open, generous, and true, the heart brave, warm, and tender, and the pulse a man. Strike, shadow, strike, and see his good deeds springing from the wound to sow the world with life immortal. No voice pronounced these words in Scrooge's ears, and yet he heard them. When he looked upon the bed, he thought, if this man could be raised up now, and would be foremost thoughts, advise, hard dealing, griping cares, they have brought him to a rich end truly. He lay in the dark, empty house with not a man, a woman, or a child to say that he was kind to me in this or that, and for the memory of one kind word, I will be kind to him. A cat was tearing at the door, and there was a sound of gnawing rats beneath the hearthstone. What they wanted in the room of death, and why they were so restless and disturbed, Scrooge did not dare to think. Spirit, he said, this is a fearful place. In living it, I shall not leave its lesson. Trust me, let us go. Still the ghost pointed with an unmoved finger to the head. I understand you, Scrooge returned, and I wouldn't do it if I could, but I have not the power, Spirit, I have not the power. Again it seemed to look upon him. If there is any person in this town who feels emotion caused by this man's death, said Scrooge, quite agonized, show that person to me, Spirit, I beseech you. The phantom spread its dark robe before him for a moment, like a wing, and withdrawing it, revealed a room by daylight where a mother and her children were. She was expecting someone, and with anxious eagerness, for she walked up and down the room, started at every sound, looked out from the window, glanced at the clock, tried but in vain to work with her needle, and it could hardly bear the voice of the children in their play. At length the long-expected knock was heard. She hurried to the door and met her husband, a man whose face was careworn and depressed. Though he was young, there was a remarkable expression in it now, a kind of serious delight of which he felt ashamed and which he struggled to repress. He sat down to the dinner that had been hoarding for him by the fire when she asked him faintly, "What news?" which was not until after a long silence he appeared embarrassed how to answer. "Is it good," she said, "or bad?" To help him. "Bad," he answered. "We are quite ruined." "No, there is hope yet, Caroline." If he relents, she said, amazed, there is. Nothing is past hope if such a miracle has happened. He is past relenting, said her husband. He is dead. She was a mild and patient creature, if her face spoke truth, but she was thankful in her soul to hear it. And she said so with clasped hands. She prayed forgiveness for the next moment and was sorry, but the first was the emotion of her heart. What the half-drunken woman whom I told you of last night said to me when I tried to see him and obtain a week's delay, and what I thought was a mere excuse to avoid me turns out to have been quite true. He was not only very ill, but dying then. To whom will our debt be transferred? I don't know. But before this time we shall be ready with the money, and even though we were not, it would be a bad fortune indeed to find so merciful a creditor in his success. We may sleep tonight with light hearts, Caroline. Yes. Softened as if they would, their hearts were lighter. The children's faces hushed and clustered around to hear what they so little understood, were brighter, and it was a happier house for this man's death. The only emotion that the ghost could show upon him, caused by the event, was one of pleasure. Let me see some tenderness connected with death, said Scrooge, or that dark chamber, spirit, which we left just now, will be forever present to me. The ghost conducted him through several streets familiar to his feet, and as they went along, Scrooge looked here and there to find himself, but nowhere was he to be seen. They entered the poor Bob Cratchit's house, the dwelling he had visited before, and found the mother and the children seated round the fire. Quiet. Very quiet, the noisy little Cratchits were as still as statues in one corner, and sat looking up at Peter, who had a book before him. The mother and her daughters were engaged in sewing, but surely they were very quiet. And he took a child and set him in the midst of them. Where had Scrooge heard these words? He had not dreamed them. The boy must have read them out as he had the spirit cross the threshold. Why did he not go on? The mother laid her work upon the table and put her hand to her face. The contour hurts my eyes, she said. The color? Oh, poor Tiny Tim. They're better now again, said Cratchit's wife. It makes them weak by candlelight, and I wouldn't show weak eyes to your father when he comes home. For the world, it must be near his time. Past it, rather, Peter answered, shutting up his book. But I think that he has walked a little slower than he used to these last evenings. They were very quiet again at last, she said, and in a steady, cheerful voice that only faltered once. I have known him walk with Tiny Tim upon his shoulders very fast indeed. And so have I, cried Peter, often. And so have I, explained another. So had all. But he was a very light to carry, he resumed, intent upon our work, and his father loved him so, that it was no trouble, and there's your father at the door. She hurried out to meet him, and little Bob in his comforter, he had no need of it, poor fellow, came in. His tea was ready for him on the hob, and they all tried who shouldn't help him do it most. Then the two young Cratchits got upon his knees and laid each child a little cheek against his cheek, as if they said, "Don't mind it, father, don't be grieved." Bob was very cheerful with them and spoke pleasantly to all the family. He looked at the work upon the table and praised the industry and speed of Mrs. Cratchit and the girls. They would be done long before Sunday, he said. Sunday? You went today, then, Robert? Asked his wife. Yes, my dear, returned Bob. I wish you could have gone. It would have done you good to see how green a place it is, but you'll see it often. I promised him that I would walk there on a Sunday. My little child, cried Bob. My little child. He broke down at once. He couldn't help it. If he could have helped it, he would have been further apart, perhaps, than they were. He left the room and went upstairs into the room above, where he lighted cheerfully and hung with Christmas. There was a chair set close beside the child, and there were signs of someone having been there lately. Poor Bob sat down in it, and when he had thought a little and composed himself, he kissed the little face. He was reconciled to see what had happened, and went down again, quite happy. They drew about the fire and talked, the girls and mother working still, but told them of the extraordinary kindness of Mr. Scrooge, his nephew, whom he had scarcely seen but once, and who, meeting him in the street that day, and seeing that he looked just a little down, you know, said Bob, inquired what had happened to distress him. Oh, which, said Bob, for he is the pleasantest spoken gentleman you have ever heard. I told him, I am heartily sorry for it, Mr. Cratchit, he said, and he'd heartily sorry for your good wife. By the by, how he ever knew that, I don't know. Knew what, my dear? Why, you were a good wife, replied Bob. Everybody knows that, said Peter. Very well observed, my boy, cried Bob. I hope they do. Heartily sorry, he said, for your good wife. If I can be of service to you in any way, he said, giving me his card, that's where I live. Pray come to me. Now it wasn't, cried Bob, for the sake of anything he might be able to do for us, so much as for his kind way, that this was quite delightful. It really seemed as if he had known our Tiny Tim and felt with us. I'm sure he's a good soul, said Mrs. Cratchit. You would be sure of it, my dear, returned Bob. If you saw him and spoke to him, I shouldn't be at all surprised, mark what I say, if he got Peter a better situation. Only hear that, Peter, said Mrs. Cratchit. And then, cried one of the girls, Peter will be keeping company with someone and setting up for himself. Get along with you, retorted Peter, grinning. It's just as likely as not, said Bob. One of these days, though, there's plenty of time for that, my dear. But however and whenever we part from one another, I'm sure we shall be none of us forget poor Tiny Tim, shall we, or this first parting there was among us? Never, father, cried they all. And I know, said Bob, I know, my dears, that we recollect how patient and how mild he was. Although he was a little child, we shall not quarrel easily among ourselves and forget poor Tiny Tim in doing it. No, never, father, they all cried again. I'm very happy, said little Bob. I'm very happy. Mrs. Cratchit kissed him, his daughters kissed him, the two young Cratchits kissed him, and Peter and himself shook hands. Spirit of Tiny Tim, thy childish essence was from God. Spectre, said Scrooge, something informs me that our parting moment is at hand. I know it, but I know not how. Tell me what man was whom we saw lying dead. The ghost of Christmas yet to come conveyed him, as before, through a different time. He thought indeed they seemed no order in the latter visions, save that they were in the future, into the resorts of a businessman, but he showed himself. Indeed, the spirit did not stay for anything, but went straight on, as to the end just how desired, until besought by Scrooge to tarry for a moment. This court, said Scrooge, through which we hurry now, is where my place of occupation is, and has been for length of time. I see the house. Let me behold what I shall be in days to come. The spirit stopped, The hand was pointed elsewhere. "The house is yonder," Scrooge explained. "Why do you point away?" The inexorable finger underwent no change. Scrooge hastened to the window of his office and looked in. It was an office still, but not his. The furniture was not the same, and the figure in the chair was not himself. The phantom pointed as before. He joined it once again, and wondering whither he had gone, accompanied it until they reached an iron gate. He paused to look around before entering. A churchyard here, then? The wretched man, whose name he had now to learn, lay underneath the ground. It was a worthy place, walled in by houses, overrun by grass and weeds, the growth of vegetation's death, not life, choked up with too many, bearing fat with repelled appetite. A worthy place? The spirit stood among the graves and pointed down to one. He advanced toward it, trembling. The phantom was exactly as it had been, but he dreaded that he saw new meaning in its solemn shape. "Before I draw nearer to that stone to which you point," said Scrooge, "answer me one question. Are these the shadows of the things that will be, or are they the shadows of things that may be only?" Still the ghost pointed downward to the grave by which it stood. "Man's course will foreshadow certain ends, to which, if preserved in, they must lead," said Scrooge. "But if the course be departed, the end will change. Say it is thus with what you show me." The spirit was immovable as ever. Scrooge crept toward it, trembling as he went, and following the finger, read upon the stone of the neglected grave his own name, Ebenezer Scrooge. "Am I the man who lay upon the bed?" he cried, upon his knees. The finger pointed from the grave to him and back again. "No, spirit, no, no, no." The finger still was there. "Spirit," he cried, tight clutching at its robes, "hear me. I am not the man I was. I will not be that man I must have been. But for the intercourse, why, show me this, if I am past all hope." For the first time the hands appeared to shake. "Good spirit," he paused. "Good spirit," he pursued, as down upon the ground he fell before it. "Your nature intercedes for me and pities me. Assure me that I may change these shadows, and have shown me by an altered life." The kind hand trembled. "I will honor Christmas in my heart, and I will try to keep it all year. I will live in the past, the present, and the future. The spirits of all three shall strive within me. I will not shut out the lessons that they teach. Oh, tell me I may sponge away the writing on the stone." In his agony he caught the spectral hand. It sought to free itself, but for the strong in its eternity, and detained it. The spirit, stronger yet, repulsed him. Holding up his hands in the last prayer to have his fate reversed, he saw an alteration in the phantom's hood and dress. It shrunk, collapsed, and dwindled down into a bedpost. Chapter 5. The end of it. Yes, and the bedpost was his own. The bed was his own. The room was his own. Best and happiest of all, the time before him was his own, to make amends. "I will live in the past, the present, and the future," Scrooge repeated, as he scrambled out of bed. "The spirits of all three strive within me. Oh, Jacob Marley, heaven and the Christmas time be praised for this. I say it on my knees, old Jacob, on my knees." He was so fluttered and so glowing with his good intentions that his broken voice would scarcely answer to his call. He had been sobbing violently in his conflict with the spirit, and his face were wet with tears. "They are not torn down," cried Scrooge, folding one of his bed curtains in his arms. "They are not torn down, rings and all. They are here. I am here. The shadows of the things that would have been may be dispelled. They will be. I know they will." His hands were busy with his garments all the time, turning them inside out, putting them on upside down, tearing them, mislaying them, making them parties to every kind of extravagance. "I don't know what to do," cried Scrooge, laughing and crying in the same breath, and making a perfect lacoon of himself with his stockings. "I am as light as a feather. I am happier as an angel. I am merry as a schoolboy. I am giddy as a drunken man. A Merry Christmas to everybody. A Happy New Year to all the world. Hello there. Whoop! Hello." He had frisked into the sitting room and was now standing there perfectly winded. "There's the saucepan that the gruel was in," said Scrooge, starting off again and going around the fireplace. "There's the door by which the ghost of Jacob Marley entered. There's the corner where the ghost of Christmas present sat. There's the window where I saw the wandering spirits. It's all right. It's all true. It all happened. Ha, ha, ha." Really, for a man who has been out of practice for so many years, it was a splendid laugh, a most illustrious laugh, the father of a laugh, line of brilliant laughs. "I don't know what day of the month it is," said Scrooge. "I don't know how long I've been among the spirits. I don't know anything. I'm quite a baby. Never mind, I don't care. I'd rather be a baby. Hallo, whoop, hallo here." He was checked in his transports by the churches ringing out the lowliest peals he had ever heard. Clash, clang, hammer, ding, dong, bell, bell, dong, ding, hammer, clang, clash. Oh, glorious, oh, glorious. Running to the window, he opened it and put out his head. No fog, no mist, clear, bright, jovial, stirring cold, piping for the blood to dance to, golden sunlight, heavenly sky, sweet fresh air, merry bells, oh glorious, glorious. "What's today?" cried Scrooge, calling downward to a boy in Sunday clothes who perhaps had loitered in to look about him. "Eh?" returned the boy with all his might of wonder. "What's today, my fine fellow?" said Scrooge. "Today," replied the boy. "Why, Christmas Day." "It's Christmas Day," said Scrooge to himself. "I haven't missed it. The spirits have done it all in one night. They can do anything they like. Of course they can. Of course they can. Hallo, my fine, hallo, hallo," returned the boy. "Do you know the poulterers in the next street, but one at the corner?" Scrooge inquired. "I should hope I do," replied the lad. "An intelligent boy," said Scrooge. "A remarkable boy. Do you know whether they've sold the prize turkey that was hanging up there? Not the little prize turkey, but the big one." "What? That one's as big as me," returned the boy. "What a delightful boy," said Scrooge. "It's a pleasure to talk to him." "Yes, my buck. It's hanging there now," replied the boy. "It is," said Scrooge. "Go and buy it." "Walker," explained the boy. No, said Scrooge. "I am in earnest. Go and buy it and tell him to bring it here, that I may give them the direction to where to take it. Come back with the man, and I'll give you a shilling. Come back with him in less than 5 minutes, and I'll give you half a crown." The boy was off like a shot. He must have had steady hand at a trigger. He could not have given a shot off half so fast. "I'll send it to Bob Cratchit's," whispered Scrooge, rubbing his hand and splitting with a laugh. "Ha! She'd know what to do. It's twice the size of Tiny Tim. Joe Miller never made such a joke as sending it to a boy's Wilby." The hand in which he wrote the address was not a steady one, but write it did he, somehow, and went down the stairs upon the street door, ready for the coming of the poulterer's man. As he stood there, waiting for his arrival, the knocker caught his eye. I shall love it as long as I live, cried Scrooge, patting it with his hand. I scarcely ever look at it before. What an honest expression it was in its face. It's a wonderful knocker. Here's the turkey. Hello, whoop. How are you? Merry Christmas. It was a turkey. He never could have stood upon its legs, that bird. He would have snapped them short off in a minute. Little sticks of sealing wax. Why, it's impossible to carry that to Camden Town, said Scrooge. You must have a cab. The chuckle with which he said this, and the chuckle with which he paid for the turkey, and the chuckle with which he paid for the cab, and the chuckle with which he recomposed the boy, were only to be exceeded by a chuckle with which he sat down breathless in his chair again, and chuckled till he cried. Shaving was not an easy task, for his hand continued to shake very much, and shavings require attention, even when you don't dance while you're at it. But if he had to cut the end of his nose off, he would have put a piece of sticking plaster over it and been quite satisfied. He dressed himself all in the best, and at the last got into the street. The people were by this time pouring forth, as he had seen them with the ghost of Christmas present, and walking with his hands behind him, Scrooge regarded every one with a delightful smile. He looked so irresistibly pleasant, in a word, that 3 or 4 good-humored fellows said, "Good morning, sir, and Merry Christmas to you." And Scrooge said often afterwards that all the little blithe sounds he had ever heard, those were the blithest in his ears. He had not gone far when, coming on towards him, he beheld the portly gentleman who had walked into his counting-house the day before and said, "Scrooge and Marley's, I believe." It sent a pain across his heart to think how this old gentleman would look upon him when they met, but he knew that the path lay straight before him, and he took it. "My dear sir," said Scrooge, quickening his pace and taking the old gentleman by both his hands, "how do you do? I hope you succeeded yesterday. It was very kind of you. A Merry Christmas to you, sir." "Mr. Scrooge?" "Yes," said Scrooge, "that's my name, and I fear I may not be pleasant to you. Allow me to ask your pardon, and will you have goodness—" Here Scrooge whispered in his ear. "Lord bless me," cried the gentleman, as if his breath were taken away. "My dear Scrooge, are you serious?" "If you please," said Scrooge, "not a farthing less. A great many back payments are included in it, I assure you. Will you do me that favor?" "My dear sir," said another, shaking hands with him, "I don't know what to say to such magnificent—" "Don't say anything, please," retorted Scrooge. "Come and see me. Will you come and see me?" "I will," cried the old gentleman, and it was clear he meant to do it. "Thank ye," said Scrooge. "I am much obliged to you. I thank you 50 times. Bless you." He went to church and walked about the streets and watched the people hurrying to and fro, and patted children on the head and questioned beggars, and looked down into the kitchens of houses, and upon the windows he found that everything could yield him pleasure. He had never dreamed that any walk, that anything could give him so much happiness. In the afternoon he turned his steps towards his nephew's house. He passed the door a dozen times before he had the courage to go up and knock, but he made a dash and did it. "Is your master at home, my dear?" said Scrooge to the girl. "Nice girl, very." "Yes, sir." "Where is he, my love?" said Scrooge. "He's in the dining room, sir, along with mistress. I'll show you upstairs, if you please." "Thank ye, he knows me," said Scrooge, with his hand already on the dining-room lock. "I'll go in here, my dear." He turned it gently and sided his face in and round the door. They were looking at the table, which was spread out in a great array, for these young housekeepers are always nervous on such points and like to see that everything is right. "Fred," said Scrooge. Dear heart alive, how his niece by marriage startled. Scrooge had forgotten for the moment about her sitting in the corner with the footstool, or wouldn't have done it on any account. Why, bless my soul, cried Fred. Who's that? It's I, your Uncle Scrooge. I have come to dinner. Will you let me in, Fred? Let him in. It is a mercy he didn't shake his arm off. He was at home in 5 minutes. Nothing could be heartier. His niece looked just the same. So did Topper when he came. So did the plump sister when she came. So did everyone when they came. Wonderful party, wonderful games, wonderful unanimity, wonderful happiness. But he was early at the office the next morning. Oh, he was early there. If he could only be there first and catch Bob Cratchit coming late. That was the thing he had set his heart upon. And he did it. Yes, he did. The clock struck 9. No Bob. 1/4 past. No Bob. He was full 18 minutes and a half behind the time. Scrooge sat with the door wide open that he might see him come into the tank. His hat was off before he opened the door, his comforter too. He was on his stool in a jiffy, driving away with his pen as if he were trying to overtake 9 o'clock. "Hallo," growled Scrooge, in his accustomed voice as near as he could feign it. "What do you mean by coming here at this time of day?" "I'm very sorry, sir," said Bob. "I am behind my time." "You are," repeated Scrooge. "Yes, I think you are. Step this way, sir, if you please." "It's only once a year, sir," pleaded Bob, appearing from the tank. "It shall not be repeated. I was making rather merry yesterday, sir." "Now, I'll tell you what, my friend," said Scrooge. "I'm not going to stand for this sort of thing any longer, and therefore," he continued, leaping from a stool and giving Bob such a dig in the waistcoat that he staggered back into the tank again, "and therefore I'm about to raise your salary." Bob trembled and got a little nearer to the ruler. He had a momentary idea of knocking Scrooge down with it, holding him and calling for the people in the court for help in the strait waistcoat. "A Merry Christmas, Bob," said Scrooge, with an earnest that could not be mistaken, as he clapped him on the back. "A merrier Christmas, Bob, my good fellow, that I have given you for many a year. I'll raise your salary and endeavor to assist your struggling family, and we will discuss your affairs this very afternoon over a Christmas bowl of smoking bishops, Bob. Make up the fires and buy another coal satchel before you do't. Another eye, Bob Cratchit." Scrooge was better than his word. He did it all, and infinitely more, and to Tiny Tim, who did not die. He was a second father. He became a good friend, a good master, and a good man as the good old city knew, or any other good old town or borough in the good old world. Some people laughed to see the alteration in him, but he let them laugh, and little heeded them, for he was wise enough to know that nothing ever happened on this globe for good, at which some people did not have their fill of laughter in the outset, and knowing that such as these would be blind anyway, he thought of it quite as well that they should wrinkle up their eyes and grins, and have the madly in less attractive forms. His own heart laughed, and that was quite enough for him. He had no further intercourse with the spirits, but lived upon the total absentee principle ever afterwards, and it was always said to him that he knew how to keep Christmas well, if any man alive possessed the knowledge. May that be truly said of us, all of us, and so, as Tiny Tim observed, God bless us, every one. You have been listening to a production of A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. Look in the playlist below for our other videos, and thank you for listening.